A cop arrests the wrong woman, shocked in court, when he learns she's the state's chief prosecutor. What if the very person entrusted to uphold the law decided to break it? What if a routine patrol turned into a nightmare for an officer who didn't expect the woman he arrested to be the state's chief prosecutor? Late one night, a seemingly ordinary encounter between a police officer and a woman walking home would take a dark, unexpected turn. When the officer, Blake Tyler, arrests the woman, he's oblivious to the truth. But when the case reaches the courtroom, the revelation leaves him and everyone else speechless. Stay with me, because this story will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. Before we dive into this, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. If you love stories about resilience, justice, and powerful twists, be sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more stories that will leave an impact. Your support helps us share these life-changing stories with more people. Now let's jump right in. The city's streets were alive with the usual nocturnal hum, a mix of distant car horns, murmured conversations of late-night street vendors, and the rhythmic clatter of shoes tapping against the wet pavement. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows on the damp asphalt. It was a night like any other, but for Cassandra Miller, this would be far from an ordinary evening. Dressed in an immaculate navy suit, a leather briefcase swinging from her hand, Cassandra walked briskly down the sidewalk. She had just finished her preparations for a major trial, one that could change the course of her career and perhaps make waves in the ongoing fight against systemic injustice. She was exhausted but determined, her mind preoccupied with legal strategies, case files, and the overwhelming weight of responsibility. She didn't notice the patrol car idling at the corner until it was too late. Officer Blake Tyler sat slouched in the driver's seat, lazily resting his hand on the steering wheel. His partner, Officer Daniels, was scrolling through his phone, indifferent to their surroundings. But Blake's eyes snapped to Cassandra as she walked past. "Well, well," he muttered under his breath, watching her every move with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "What do we have here?" "Just another late-night walker," Daniels replied, absent-mindedly, barely looking up. "Let it go, man." But Blake, eyes narrowing, couldn't help but fixate on Cassandra. "No, she's out of place here. Too well dressed, fancy briefcase, not right for this neighborhood." Without waiting for his partner's response, Blake opened the car door and stepped out, boots splashing in a shallow puddle, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night. Cassandra, lost in thought, heard the approaching sound of someone walking behind her. She paused, sensing the shift in the air. "Evening, ma'am," Blake's voice called, dripping with false politeness as he walked toward her, hand resting near his holstered weapon. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here?" Cassandra raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but sharp. "Walking home. Is that a crime now?" Blake's lips twisted into a tight smirk. "Depends. Got any ID?" Cassandra set her briefcase down, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not required to show you my ID unless you have reasonable suspicion that I've committed a crime." Blake's eyes flashed with irritation. "You look suspicious. That's enough for me." "Suspicious?" Cassandra asked, her voice steady. "In what way? You don't belong here. Fancy suit, fancy bag, doesn't fit with the locals." Blake leaned in slightly, a sneer curling his lip. "Maybe you've got something in that briefcase you shouldn't." Her patience snapped, her voice cutting through the air with authority. "Officer, you're making baseless assumptions. This is an unlawful search. I know my rights." Blake's eyes darkened, and he crossed his arms over his chest. Big words from someone who thinks they're above the law. Before Cassandra could respond, Blake seized her arm and twisted it behind her back with unnecessary force, slapping the handcuffs on tightly. Her briefcase hit the ground, papers scattering across the wet pavement. "This is illegal," Cassandra protested, struggling against his hold. "You're making a huge mistake." Blake yanked her toward the patrol car, ignoring her cries. "Tell it to the judge," he muttered coldly, as a small crowd began to gather. One man stepped forward, phone raised. "Hey, what are you doing? She didn't do anything." Blake whirled, his voice harsh. "Step back. This is police business." Cassandra, being pushed into the back of the patrol car, met the man's eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm despite the rising tension. "Please keep recording." The man nodded, his phone camera capturing the unfolding scene as the doors slammed shut. Inside the car, Cassandra sat still, her fists clenched. Every instinct screamed for her to fight back, to demand her release. But she knew better. Blake and his fellow officers thrived on resistance, using it as justification. She'd fight, but on her terms. Blake climbed into the driver's seat and glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Awfully quiet now. Not so tough anymore, huh?" Cassandra didn't respond. Instead, she stared out the window, her mind already calculating her next move. She would make Blake regret this night for the rest of his career. The police station was dimly lit, buzzing with activity. Officers moved between desks, their voices blending into a constant hum. Blake marched Cassandra through the entrance, his grip tight on her arm. "Got a troublemaker," Blake announced loudly, brimming with pride. Several officers glanced up, some intrigued, others indifferent. "I'm a lawyer," Cassandra said evenly, standing tall despite the harsh treatment. "And you're all going to regret this." Blake let out a mocking laugh. "Sure you are. Let's see how far that gets you in here." As her fingerprints were taken and her belongings catalogued, Cassandra's mind remained focused. Each indignity, every slight, was another piece of evidence she would use to dismantle Blake's actions. Her resolve was steel. Blake had made a dangerous mistake. Back at the front desk, Officer Blake Tyler reveled in the moment, recounting the arrest with a smug grin. Caught her red-handed, walking around like she owns the place, acting all high and mighty. His partner, Officer Daniels, wasn't so sure. "You sure about this, Blake? Doesn't exactly scream criminal." Blake waved him off. "That's how they get you. Acting all innocent. She's hiding something, I can feel it." Daniels hesitated, his gaze lingering on the leather badge case Blake had tossed onto the counter. The embossed lettering caught his eye, and he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. But before he could say anything, Blake pulled him aside. "Relax. She's just a loudmouth lawyer wannabe. Trust me, she's not going anywhere." Cassandra sat in her holding cell, leaning against the cold concrete wall, eyes closed for a moment. Despite the exhaustion weighing on her body, her mind was sharp. Blake's mistake was clear. He underestimated her. She wasn't just any lawyer. She was the chief prosecutor of the state. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her thoughts. She lifted her head, her expression unreadable. Blake stood at the front of her cell, his voice dripping with mockery. "How's our VIP guest holding up?" he taunted. Cassandra met his gaze, her voice calm but sharp. "Enjoying your moment, officer? You might want to savor it. It won't last long." Blake chuckled, leaning against the bars, clearly savoring the power he thought he held over her. But Cassandra's eyes gleamed with quiet defiance. "You have no idea who you're dealing with?" Blake smirked, the edge of uncertainty creeping in as his words faltered. But he quickly recovered, sneering. "Keep dreaming. You'll have plenty of time to figure out how things work around here." As he walked away, his voice carried back to her, loud enough for everyone in the station to hear. "Some people just don't know when to quit," he said, laughing. "You'd think someone dressed like that would at least have some sense." Back at the front desk, Officer Daniels could feel something was off. He picked up the badge case again, opening it fully this time. His eyes widened when he read the name, Cassandra Miller, Chief Prosecutor of the state. "Blake," Daniels called out, his voice low and hesitant. "What now?" Blake's expression froze. That's gotta be fake. But Daniels wasn't convinced. "Looks pretty real to me." Blake's smug demeanor faltered. He shoved the badge case into his pocket, a new tension in his jaw. "Doesn't matter. She's already in custody." As Cassandra leaned back against the cold wall, she could feel the momentum shifting. She was no longer just a lawyer fighting against injustice. She was the one who would make sure Blake's actions would haunt him. The game had changed, and Cassandra Miller was just getting started. Lawsuit following his wrongful arrest of Cassandra Miller, the state's chief prosecutor. The investigation, which is gaining traction across the nation, has shed light on the deep-rooted issues of police misconduct, racial profiling, and systemic injustice. As Blake sat in the dim light of his apartment, he couldn't escape the growing realization of how quickly everything had spiraled out of his control. He had been too quick to judge, too certain in his own biases, And now he was facing the full weight of his actions. The walls of his small apartment felt like they were closing in as the news continued to play on a loop, with Cassandra Miller's name becoming a symbol of both resilience and justice. The public's response to the case was overwhelming. Protests and rallies calling for police reform erupted, with many people chanting for justice not just for Cassandra, but for all victims of discrimination and abuse at the hands of those sworn to protect them. The power of social media amplified the message, making it impossible for anyone, including those in power, to ignore. Back at the courthouse, Cassandra was taking no time to relax. The victory in court had been important, but she knew it was only the first step in a much longer battle. She had filed the civil rights lawsuit, but her efforts were now focused on the larger systemic problems within the department. She was drafting a comprehensive set of proposals aimed at reforming police training, reducing bias, and implementing strict accountability measures for officers, as well as addressing the culture of impunity that had allowed Blake and others like him to go unchecked. Despite the mounting pressure, Cassandra remained steady. She had seen the system at its worst, but she also understood that real change would require both resilience and strategy. It wasn't enough to expose the wrongdoings. She had to ensure that those changes were institutionalized, embedded in every layer of the justice system. A week later, Cassandra met with her team in her office, discussing the next phase of her plan. The meeting was filled with an air of urgency, but also determination. They had a chance to change the system, but it would take every ounce of their collective effort. Cassandra was no stranger to fighting for justice, and now, more than ever, she understood that the fight was never truly over. In a final twist of fate, the investigation into Blake's conduct grew to encompass more than just him. Internal Affairs had uncovered a pattern of inappropriate behavior, including the targeting of minority communities and a history of excessive use of force. The department was in full crisis mode, with several officers facing disciplinary actions, and the mayor's office was now under intense pressure to take action. The journey for justice was far from complete, but as Cassandra stood by the window of her office one last time, she felt the fire of hope reigniting. She had made her mark, but the road ahead was long and filled with challenges. It was a journey she was prepared to take, for the sake of those who had been silenced for too long. And so, the fight continued, not just for her own dignity, but for the future of justice itself. Every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory in the ongoing struggle for a fairer, more equitable society. And Cassandra Miller was leading that charge, one step at a time. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a textbook example of systemic abuse of power. And Cassandra Miller would make it her mission to ensure that every single detail of the situation was brought to light. The hours crept by, the once bustling station growing quieter as the overnight shift wound down. Blake had retreated to his desk, pretending to work, yet his eyes kept drifting toward the holding cells. Despite his earlier bravado, a sense of unease was beginning to crawl beneath his skin. He knew something was coming, but he couldn't quite bring himself to understand how severe it would be. Meanwhile, Daniels, realizing the stakes were higher than he'd anticipated, dove into some research. A quick search on his phone confirmed the identity of Cassandra Miller. The articles that popped up painted a picture of a formidable legal mind, a woman who had dismantled corruption cases and sent powerful figures to prison. Blake's throat tightened with an unsettling realization. "Blake," Daniels called out, his voice tinged with urgency. Blake barely acknowledged him, waving him off. "I'll handle it. Just stick to your job," he muttered, though his words held less conviction than he intended. Dawn was breaking when Cassandra sat calmly on the bench, her posture immaculate, an aura of unshakable serenity radiating from her. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the narrow barred window, casting a soft glow over her composed features. In that moment, she looked less like a prisoner awaiting judgment, and more like a warrior preparing for battle. Her mind was clear, her strategy forming with the precision of a skilled strategist. She would not yell, she would not demand. She would let the system expose its own corruption piece by piece, until there was nowhere left for Blake Tyler to hide. As the clock ticked, the station grew quieter. Blake had long since stopped pretending to work, his eyes darting toward the holding cells, feeling the weight of something he couldn't shake. In the distance, the sound of a door creaking open signaled that the moment was near. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hall, drawing closer. Cassandra straightened, her heartbeat steady as her resolve solidified. She was ready. Clerks organizing documents, the occasional murmur from the gallery as the day began. For most, it was a typical day, but for Cassandra Miller, seated at the defendant's table, every second felt like it would change everything. Her sharp navy suit contrasted sharply with the muted beige walls, an emblem of strength and determination. Her composure was commanding, her silence speaking louder than any words she could utter. Her fingers tapped lightly on the polished wooden table, each beat like the ticking of a clock, counting down to an inevitable reckoning. Officer Blake Tyler swaggered into the courtroom, his uniform crisp and his smirk firmly in place. He believed the system would protect him. He was certain of it. The judge, a stern figure with sharp glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, called the room to order. Blake strode to the witness stand, adjusting his tie with a practiced ease, exuding confidence as he began to recount the events of that fateful night. "She was acting suspicious," Blake declared, his voice steady and sure. "Walking alone, late at night, in a high-crime area, carrying a bag full of papers. When I approached, she became uncooperative, refusing to show ID. It's my duty to ensure public safety, and her behavior raised red flags. So I made the arrest." From her seat, Cassandra tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp yet unreadable. She did not interrupt, allowing Blake to spin his narrative without interference. Her silence was a deliberate move. She wanted him to dig his own grave. The prosecutor, a young woman with a clear sense of purpose, stood and approached. "Officer Tyler," she asked calmly, "you mentioned that the defendant's behavior was suspicious. Can you clarify what specific actions led you to that conclusion?" Blake hesitated for a split second, caught off guard by the prosecutor's sharpness. "She was out of place, dressed too formally for the area, acting defensive when questioned." The prosecutor's eyebrows raised slightly. "And by out of place, you mean what, exactly?" Blake shifted uneasily. His confident facade was beginning to crack. "She didn't fit the profile of someone who lives in that neighborhood." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. "So, to clarify, your suspicion was based on her appearance and her location?" Blake's jaw tightened, his face reddening. "Yes." "And her refusal to cooperate." "Thank you, officer," the prosecutor said. Her tone was even, but her words left no room for ambiguity. "No further questions." As the judge prepared to move the proceedings forward, Cassandra stood up slowly. The sound of her chair scraping across the floor cut through the tension in the room, drawing every eye toward her. Her movements were deliberate, each step toward the podium measured and purposeful. "Your Honor," Cassandra's voice rang out, calm but resonant, "I request permission to represent myself for the remainder of this hearing." The judge looked over the rim of his glasses, intrigued. "Are you certain, Miss Miller?" "I am," Cassandra replied, her tone unwavering. "I believe it will expedite the proceedings." The judge nodded, granting her request. Cassandra stepped to the podium, adjusting the microphone as her gaze locked onto Blake. She could see the subtle shift in his demeanor, his smirk faltering as his confidence began to crumble. "Officer Tyler," she began, her voice cool and composed, "you testified that my behavior was suspicious. Would you agree that suspicion requires specific articulable facts?" Blake swallowed, suddenly unsure. "Yes. And yet," Cassandra continued, her voice smooth as silk, "your testimony hinges entirely on subjective observations. My attire, my location. Can you point to any law that makes walking in public, dressed professionally, a crime?" Blake's face flushed, but he quickly tried to recover. "No." "But," Cassandra interrupted, her words sharp and decisive, "you claim that I refused to cooperate. But did I not inform you that I am a practicing attorney and that your actions were violating my rights?" Blake clenched his hands on the edge of the stand, his unease evident. "You said something like that." "And yet," Cassandra pressed, her gaze unwavering, Did you make any effort to verify my identity after I presented my credentials? Blake fumbled in his pocket, pulling out his badge case with trembling hands. The room held its breath as the bailiff took the case to the judge. As the judge examined it, his expression shifted. Surprise, then recognition. "Miss Miller," the judge said, his voice softer now. "This confirms you are the chief prosecutor of the state." A collective gasp swept through the room. Blake's face drained of color as Cassandra turned back to him. Her eyes were a mixture of fury and quiet resolve.